Bayard Rustin. Surely one of the fundamental American advocates of nonviolence. I think he basically brought nonviolence to the King movement, the Montgomery bus boycott and so on, or to the civil rights movement, because he worked not only very closely with King, especially on the March on Washington in '63, but with A. Philip Randolph, for example, who might have been the preeminent black leader before King, immediately before King. Also on a March on Washington, like the March on Washington movement, very closely associated with A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King. And also with, by the way, my step-grandmother was the longtime mistress of A. Philip Randolph. So he's a bit of a legend in my family, believe it or not. Grandma's boyfriend, right? Thyra Edwards was her name. So even if A. Philip Randolph wasn't perfectly faithful to his wife, I don't know, he was a brilliant civil rights leader. Now, the Rustin story is really amazing because, maybe you've seen some of the documentaries and so on. Just a fascinating figure. All right. For one thing, he was raised Quaker. Okay. And he was also a convinced Quaker in the Philadelphia area. Chester, does that sound right? Raised by his grandmother, fundamentally, who was a Quaker. So his pacifism comes intrinsically out of this great tradition. He worked for his first line of work as an activist was for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Now, this is a person that I thought about doing an episode on. It's possible I'll go back and get one, do one. A.J. Muste, M-U-S-T-E, Muste, and the Fellowship of Reconciliation. An important pacifist organizer between the wars and stuff like this. A biography of Muste is called American Gandhi. And that's one element that Rustin brought, was an immersion in Gandhi's thought and the history of the Gandhi movement. And, if you read Rustin, I guess I'm using this book, Time on Two Crosses, in everything he writes, basically, Gandhi arises, okay? When in his own correspondence with King and stuff like this, Rustin is saying like, okay, this is what Gandhi did. All right, so let's try it like this. All right. And he's the main sort of nonviolent tactician. He's almost like a clearinghouse of nonviolent strategies. He's working with the American Friends Service Committee and stuff in the 30s or in the 40s. And, creating like guides to nonviolent resistance, including one called Speak Truth to Power, which is, if you're saying that in 49, you're early to the phrase, which we've been using ever since. I guess one thing about him, like he's painfully, I guess I say this about Dorothy Day too a little bit, like he's painfully sincere and here. He makes himself so vulnerable. He's so present in his own actions and writings and speeches and so on, and so human that it's moving, and you almost feel like wanting to help him create a shell around his personality so he can withstand some of what's going to come to him, which is terrifying. Right? But so he's a gay man. That's why this is Time on Two Crosses: the cross of race and the cross of sexual orientation. And he was an out gay man really from early on. All right, and including arrests and shit like this. And this was a big problem for him in the civil rights movement. People were trying to get rid of him because they feared the publicity, or they were themselves homophobes of the worst kind, like Adam Clayton Powell. Uh, but I think, like, if you look at Rustin's attitude toward his own sexuality, he doesn't understand why anybody is puzzled or judgmental about it. He's just like an aspect of himself. It's not something that he was ever at pains to disguise, it seems, which is very unusual, okay? Especially in the kind of context that he's rolling in, you know. And the same is true with his pacifism and his civil rights activism. It's like he's just right there. It's just very explicit. It's not his communication. It doesn't appear strategic. It's so sincere and beautiful. Okay, and so effective as it turned out. Like, he was quite an effective activist. In a lot of ways, he was the organizing force behind the, day-to-day details of organizing the March on Washington or whatever, or organizing the A. Philip Randolph Center, and so on. Getting rid of a bug there. There's all kinds of ways to go here. He served 3 years in prison, the federal prison in Allenwood. Is that right? For conscientious subjection in World War II. They put him in prison for 3 years. And he served gratefully, almost, like that was the attitude he manifested. Like, thank you for this opportunity, like, for me to sacrifice myself in this way for my beliefs or whatever. All right. One thing I wonder about is why. I could try to. I'm not even sure how. Well, I guess I could research this in some way. My stepfather was a conscientious objector in World War II. They did not send him to prison. They sent him, to pretty brutal alternative service situations, logging, farming, and he did contract polio and was a paraplegic for the rest of his life in CO camp, which was a farm. But they sent my stepfather, Richard Abel, to log or to farm, and they sent Bayard Rustin to prison. Bayard Rustin was in prison on and off a lot of times, always for protests, okay? Although one time for a sexual solicitation. He organized concerted attempts to desegregate bus lines throughout the South, way before the Montgomery bus boycott, too. Like, he did, with squads of black and white people, he experimented with taking Greyhound and Trailways buses throughout the whole South, right? Sitting in the whites only section or whatever, this is an early kind of version of Freedom Ride. This is before the King movement, all right? And then reporting systematically on which lines and which places would seat and wouldn't seat black folks and stuff like that, all right? And he was arrested for that, like for refusing to move on a bus, stuff like this, and ended up doing a few months of forced labor, right, in North Carolina, and writing an extremely moving and revealing account of that, including the characters of the people that he was incarcerated with, and especially, and this is typical of him, their raps. Okay, this is like 1940s rapping, and he quotes it at length because he was a musician and a singer too. And actually, it does look to me just like prisoners in forced labor in North Carolina in 1940 something were rapping in very similar ways to the way the Furious Five are rapping some decades later, including playing the dozens and stuff like insult raps and battling each other and stuff. But that's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting aside. But the main thing is like he's trying to teach these prisoners to, first of all, even to affirm their jailers. In all that he did, he wanted to express love for everybody. Every time he protested someone, he expressed his respect for them. He thought of each person as a precious child of God, including, Bull Connor or whatever. Right? And he manifested that. Okay, so what am I going to do? There's a fair amount. I mean, he wasn't primarily a writer. This is the collected writings, and it's not very much. It's not very thick. But I thought I would do this, like very early Rustin pacifism. This is his letter to the draft board in 1943 to claim a status as a conscientious objector. And it just has a lot of Rustin in it. And I can't imagine how the draft board didn't just simply recognize him as a legitimate conscientious objector and, I guess let him go to CO camp or whatever. Or I would have just said, like, go on your way, bro. He was raised a Quaker, man. I think they looked at him and went like, you claim to be raised a Quaker? Black guy? Like, no, I don't think so. All right. I think they... I'm just hoping that they didn't send him to jail, whereas they sent my stepfather to farm, because he was black. He also probably had some communist connections in the 40s or whatever, like almost every black activist and stuff did. Right? Maybe that accounts for it, like why this draconian punishment for this obviously legitimate objector. Okay. So this is his letter to the draft board, 1943, local board number 63, 2050 Amsterdam Avenue, New York, New York. Gentlemen, for 8 years, I have believed war to be impractical and a denial of our Hebrew Christian tradition. The social teachings of Jesus are 1. Respect for personality, respect for persons, personhood. 2. Service to the summum bonum, the supreme good. 3. Overcoming evil with good, Sermon on the Mount. 4. The brotherhood of man. These principles, as I see it, are violated by participation in war. Believing this and having before me Jesus' continued resistance to that which he considered evil, I was compelled to resist war by registering as a conscientious objector in October 1940. However, a year later, September 1941, I became convinced that conscription, as well as war, equally is inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. I must resist conscription also. So in 1940, he filed as a conscientious objector, and then in 43, as they institute conscription, he's objecting again to that. On Saturday, November 13th, 1943, I received from you an order to report for a physical examination to be taken Tuesday, November 16th at 8 o'clock in the evening. I wish to inform you that I cannot voluntarily submit to an order springing from the Selective Service and Training Act, the Selective Service and Training Act for war. There are several reasons for this decision, all stemming from the basic spiritual truth that men are brothers in the sight of God. 1. War is wrong. And like I say, I think it's typical Rustin in its almost painful straightforwardness and its deep simplicity and sincerity. War is wrong. Conscription is a concomitant of modern war. Thus, conscription for so vast an evil as war is wrong. 2. Conscription for war is inconsistent with freedom of conscience, which is not merely the right to believe, but to act on the degree of truth that one receives, to follow a vocation which is God-inspired and God-directed. And I think he felt that of himself, that he had a vocation that was God-inspired and God-directed. I find that plausible. Today, I feel that God motivates me to use my whole being to combat by non-violent means the ever-growing racial tension in the United States. At the same time, the state directs that I shall do its will. Which of these dictates can I follow? That of God or of the state? Surely I must at all times attempt to obey the law of the state. But when the will of God and the will of the state conflict, I am compelled to follow the will of God. If I cannot continue in my present vocation, I must resist. Right there, he's saying, like, I've been called by God to address civil rights in this country, and now you're interrupting that in order to draft me into a segregated war machine? I've got shit I need to do, and God is calling on me to do it. I'm sorry, I just don't have time to do your forced evil, okay? To permit you to coerce me into killing people. Right? Sorry. See, I get angry, but he doesn't express it angrily. I could never do this, dude. Like so many of these people I'm talking about, like I look at how they behaved and I go like, wow, is there some kind of neurosurgery I could have that could make me into a person like that? Like, fuck me, man. Amazing. All right, so also though, he's really connecting to the whole pacifist tradition there too. The government of God stuff. That comes straight from William Lloyd Garrison, baby. All right, this is like, the antinomianism of early American pacifists. He's got it on board. Like if there's a conflict between, or Thoreau even, if there's a conflict between the laws of man and the laws of God, I'm disobeying the laws of man. And actually, God has explicitly prohibited the stuff that you're demanding that I do. So you're really putting a choice on me. I would obey the law, your civil law if I could. If God didn't say that would be evil, I would. The Conscription Act denies brotherhood, the most basic New Testament teaching. Its design and purpose is to set men apart, German against American, American against Japanese. Its aim springs from a moral impossibility that ends justify means, that from unfriendly acts, a new and friendly world can emerge. And this is really one of the main features of pacifism and the main contrasting element, or one of the main contrasting elements in pacifist versus non-pacifist resistance versus violent resistance, is that what's the relation of means and ends? And pacifists are liable to insist that the means have to be consistent with the ends, or the ends will never be realized. Right? Or your movement to achieve the ends will actually be very likely to be totally counterproductive, to achieve exactly the opposite of what you intend or say you intend. I think that's really, really typical of resistance movements and revolutions and stuff. In practice, further, the Conscription Act separates black from white. The armed forces continue to be segregated. And you're conscripting me into a segregated organization, a racial supremacist organization. You really are asking me to violate myself and all my convictions in the most profound way. Now, if it were me, I'd tell you to fuck off or whatever, if I got to that point. but that's not what he does. Um, in practice, further, it separates black from white, those supposedly struggling for a common freedom in the army fighting Hitler. Supposedly, the blacks and the whites are struggling for a common freedom, but they are separated from each other and they are hierarchically pigeonholed. Such a separation also is based on the moral error that racism can overcome racism, that evil can produce good, that men virtually in slavery can struggle for a freedom they are denied. This means that I must protest racial discrimination in the armed forces, which is not only morally indefensible, but also a clear violation of the act, the conscription act. I wonder what bit of the act he thinks is violated by the segregated military. This does not, however, imply that I could have a part in conforming to the act if the discrimination was eliminated. So I'm not saying that I would go if you desegregated the army, though I would lose one of the absolute moral prohibitions that you're calling on me to violate. Segregation, separation, according to Jesus, is the basis of continuous violence. It was such an observation which encouraged him to teach, "It has been said to you in olden times that you shall not kill, but I say to you, do not call a man a fool." And he might have added, "For if you call him such, you will automatically separate yourself from him and violence begins." But don't even insult people. That's hard when you're in the position that Bayard Rustin is in right here. That which separates man from his brother is evil and must be resisted. I admit my share of guilt for having participated in the institutions and ways of life which helped bring fascism and war. How about that? I admit my share of guilt for having participated in the institutions and ways of life which helped bring fascism and war. I wonder what he means there. Even like paying taxes and shit? Or just taking for granted things that he should have protested? Or I'm not sure. Nonetheless, guilty as I am, and this is so typical Rustin, I now see, as did the prodigal son, that it is never too late to refuse to remain in a non-creative situation. It is never too late to refuse longer to remain in a non-creative situation. That's the way he characterizes maybe evil and violence here. The opposite of creativity. The opposite of creation. It is always timely and virtuous to change, to take in all humility a new path. Though joyfully following the will of God, I regret that I must break the law of the state. I am prepared for whatever may follow. I herewith return the material you have sent me, for conscientiously I cannot hold a card in connection with an act I no longer feel able to accept and abide by. Today I am notifying the Federal District Attorney of my decision, and am forwarding him a copy of this letter. He invited the prosecution. I appreciate now, as in the past, your advice, the draft board on Amsterdam Avenue, New York. I appreciate now, as in the past, your advice and consideration, and trust that I shall cause you no anxiety in the future. I want you to know that I deeply respect you for executing your duty to God and country in these difficult times in the way you feel you must. I remain sincerely yours, Bayard Rustin. P.S. I'm enclosing samples of the material which from time to time I've sent out to hundreds of persons, Negro and white, throughout our nation. With the Randolph movement, or with A.J. Muste's group, Fellowship of Reconciliation. This indicates one type of creative work to which God has called me. God has called me to the creative work of trying to end American racism. But you're calling me to the work of trying to kill my brothers. But I respect you so much. I love you. I see that you're trying to do what you think is right, what you think God and the nation demand. I believe you to be profoundly misguided, but I'm I'm too humble even to just say that flatly. Like, all right, it's a beautiful and profoundly Christian position that he articulates. Okay, uh, and he comes by it through immersion in Gandhi and Muste and Quakerism, and he expresses it with all the urgency and all the ideas of people like Garrison and Tolstoy. And everyone now knows what nonviolence is, and everyone associates it with the King movement. And, it's one of the major strands of protest. It's an alternative that everyone could avail themselves of. Well, we owe that really fundamentally to Bayard Rustin. Now, I don't know if I'm going to do an episode on King. Seems like you have to, right? Like famous American pacifist. I guess I probably will. All right. But, Rustin is the driver of King's nonviolence. King is the most amazing, beautiful speaker of all time, so that helps. And also quite a profound writer and thinker in his own right. So I don't know if I'll do King next. I have some people in mind. Thomas Merton for another. Cesar Chavez. I guess we should do King before Chavez maybe got going earlier. All right, and so we'll go on to some more things. But Bayard Rustin really articulated nonviolence and made it one of the basic alternatives in the world of protest and resistance and political transformation. All right, there's that one, I guess.